Andrew.Kuchling, and he is going to tell you about why projects should have what's new documents. Okay, yeah, here he goes.
Okay, thank you. My talk today is going to argue that most projects should seriously consider having what's new documents as part of their standard documentation set. So, a bit of background about me. From 1999 to 2010, I wrote what's new documents for each new release of Python 2 that came out. For version 2.0, I co-wrote an article with a fellow developer named Moshe Zadka, and I found I enjoyed the task, and so I kept writing what's new documents for 2.1, 2.2, and so on, up to 2.7. And for that decade, that was largely the primary way I contributed to Python core development. So my goal in writing my goal in writing a what's new was to fill in the gap between the very high level README and the lower level things that were available. So here are two items from the Python 2.2 README discussing new language features. One is type class unification, and there's a whole bunch of verbiage about introspecting instances, but it isn't really clear what this feature means. And in the second bullet point, we have two language features introduced with a single line. And so clearly more detail is required. Now, Python has a changelog, which is actually called the news file. And it's an immensely detailed record of every incremental change made to the source code. So, for example, going back to type class unification, each alpha and beta release of Python 2.2 had a section of its own for type class unification, discussing each small increment of feature as it was implemented. So in one alpha, del methods were supported, and docstrings now worked, and so on. And the news file also contains every single small change and bug fix. And so there are things for everything in the standard library, and it's never clear to the reader, will this change affect my code, and how important is this really? So for the what's new, I wanted to sort of provide a guided roadmap to the new features in each release. And you can find at the URL there a table of contents of all of the what's new documents that I produced. So the benefit to users of having this is clear, but I was surprised to find that there are actually benefits for the developers as well. So user benefits first. Clearly, it fills a gap between the high-level README and the low-level announcement, and the low-level news. And going and reading the original specs for a language feature is very difficult, and they're time-consuming to read. Users also found it handy when their environment bumped up one or two Python versions, as commonly happens when you go to the new version of your Linux distribution, and the version of Python goes from 2.4 to 2.5 or whatever. So it was useful to be able to read the what's new for a quick overview of what all the cute new features are. And the tutorial, putting it in a tutorial style, makes it more useful for less experienced programmers. You can put new features in perspective, and you can explain the purpose of a feature and why it was designed the way it was, and give usage examples. The usefulness for developers was primarily historical. First is it made it possible to answer historical questions about when feature X was introduced. And a developer is certainly capable of exploring the version control logs to find out when a feature was first implemented, but that's kind of time-consuming and boring, and it's much easier to scan a table of contents. Python also has a number of implementations. The primary one is called CPython, but there's also PyPy, which is written in C but different, and there's Jython, which is written in Java, and IronPython, which is in C#. And so the what's new becomes kind of a roadmap for these alternative implementations of what they need to keep up with. The most surprising thing, I thought, was that writing the what's new became really a third level of review for changes to Python. So pretty much every open source project of any size reviews commits as they're made. And this can be done after the fact by sending diffs for each commit to a mailing list where people can inspect them and comment on them. Or you can do it beforehand by putting patches into a tool such as a bug tracker or something like Review Board. Python being a widely used language and one with multiple implementations, we had to slow things down more. We had to think about new features to avoid breaking existing code too much and making life too hard for those other implementations. And so the Python developers therefore introduced Python enhancement proposals, or PEPs as they're called, which are documents that specify a given feature, discuss its implementation design, and often discuss rationales or alternate approaches that were rejected. And PEPs are discussed and examined often long before any code is actually written. So writing the what's new added a third level of review to this step, or to this process, because writing the material for the what's new meant I had to go and review all of the PEP, the documentation that had been written for a feature, and often I had to look at the current state of the implementation code or individual commits to figure out what was going on and how to explain it. And as part of this detailed inspection, I would find occasionally omissions, features in the PEP that weren't implemented or were implemented differently, and I could raise these issues on Python Dev where we could discuss them and figure out what needed to be done. So I'll describe the process and the editorial policies I followed when writing these. And I suggest you consider these practices and adapt them to be more suitable to your own projects. So the process is kind of straightforward. There was a skeleton document that I added when each new development branch was created. And over time, I developed a consistent ordering of sections that you can see here. So I started out with sort of meta changes, describing new things in the development process, like introducing a new bug tracker or new version control software. And then I went through each of the PEPs that were introduced in a particular version, just sorting them numerically. And other language changes became a miscellaneous section where small changes could be swept. And new and improved modules discussed the standard library with subsections for entire new modules that were introduced, and then a long list of changes. Getting the information to write these was straightforward. I subscribed to Python check-ins, the mailing list that gets those diffs as they're made, and I saved commit messages to a folder, and periodically I would spend an evening processing them and writing suitable text. So my one big overarching editorial policy was be useful to the reader. My imagined reader was an intermediate Python developer, but not necessarily a computer science graduate or someone who followed Python core development at all. And so this meant that I had to explain and motivate new features. So going back to Python 2.2's type class unification, I had to describe the benefits of what that meant. It meant you were now able to subclass types like Python. And I discussed the underlying implementation tool of attribute descriptors and how multiple inheritance would differ between the old style classes and the new style. And it was really a short tutorial in its own right. And I also didn't hesitate to discuss background or non-Python material, linking external sources, but also sometimes writing my own explanations of things. For example, Python 2.4 introduced a decimal data type. So to motivate this, I explained how floating point numbers introduce inaccuracies into arithmetic computations. And okay. So I wrote half a page of explanation of why floating point numbers can cause inaccuracies in certain calculations. And I linked to pages that went into more detail. And I also linked to a specification for the decimal arithmetic that the module implemented. I also tried to provide pointers into Python's development process wherever possible. So I've already mentioned how I employed PEPs as a framework for structuring my sections. I also try to link relevant background material like issues in the bug tracker, and sometimes even posts or threads on the Python dev mailing list. The idea here was that someone who's particularly interested in a particular change could dive deeper and find out how we got to that point. And I also always tried to credit sources of inspiration, whether these were other languages or external libraries. This is because I feel really strongly that software engineering is truly an engineering discipline, and therefore cherry-picking tried and tested ideas is a good thing and should be encouraged whenever possible. And I also recorded who contributed the patch, who wrote the PEP and who implemented it, which are often two different people. And in this one case, I even recorded the authors of a competing patch who had their own wrapper for this particular part of Tickle TK. And they said, no, don't use ours. This other guy's implementation is much better. And I felt that was selfless and deserved credit. And I also tried, so editorial policy number 2 was to focus on changes of relatively wide interest. Some changes are very specialized, and this is often unrelated to how much work a change actually required. But I always felt that I had a clear line of which changes sort of met that bar. And the detailed change log and the version control logs are always there for completeness, so I was okay with leaving stuff out. And the final thing was that I made things harder for myself by trying to always write new examples and explanations of things, never cutting and pasting from existing PEPs or docs. And there are probably cases where I got tired or lazy and did that, but I tried to avoid it. The rationale for writing new examples was that the what's new then provided an alternate explanation. If you didn't understand the standard library documentation or the PEP, maybe the different approach in the what's new would help. And it also forced me to analyze the language features more closely. I had to understand them better to come up with my own examples rather than just cutting and pasting. So to sum up, writing these what's new documents did have some cost. It basically consumed all of my spare time development time on Python. Although I didn't manage my time very well, and someone could certainly have been a more active developer and continued to write them. What's news don't require much maintenance after a Python final version ships. There are usually typos and small errors to fix, but Python minor releases generally don't include the kind of large change that actually gets into the what's new document. They're mostly small bug fixes. However, in return for the effort of writing them, what's news are useful for users, they are also useful for developers, and they provide a third level of detailed review by a core developer before the final project release is made. And so this is why I suggest that projects should consider making a what's new article part of their standard documentation and shipping them when the final version of the product ships. So thank you very much, and I'll now take questions.
Okay. Hello. Okay, questions. We only have time for maybe 2 questions because we are running really late.
I'll just go. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome comment, not a question. Anyone else? All right, Kenneth.